You hear me? Yes. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this distinguished panel. We at the IMF aspire to be guardians of the people, not guardians of lenders.
Music to my ear.
But let me share with you some of the things that I have learned in my career at the IMF, always working with countries that had high debt levels, sometimes high stocks of debt that are sustainable. But I've also worked in countries that actually defaulted on their on the debt because the debt was unsustainable. In particular, the cases of Republic of Congo and Zambia. So when you ask about the stock issue, I think we need to separate two different cases. One case where the debt is high, but is still deemed to be sustainable. In other words, the authorities are capable of putting together a program of economic reforms that will maintain the sustainability of debt and be able to pay its debt obligations. It may be difficult, it may be challenging, but the debt is assessed to be sustainable. And we have to differentiate this case from cases where the debt has become unsustainable. And this is largely a technical exercise that we do with country authorities, looking at your growth rate, looking at the stock of debt, and looking especially at the type of fiscal consolidation that is economically and socially feasible. And I want to emphasize this third point because when I joined the IMF in 2001, we were looking at debt sustainability largely, in my experience, as a mathematical exercise. We would look, this is the stock of debt, this is what we think the country needs to do, this is the magnitude, and this is the speed, and this is the composition of the adjustment. And yes, we would worry a little bit about growth because we know that when fiscal consolidation is large, that can affect growth. But in retrospect, we realized that in fact, we kind of underestimated the impact of this fiscal consolidation has on growth. That, you know, when there's a large fiscal adjustment, it tends to depress growth. So this is an area where we had to develop more awareness that, and our research department did some studies about this. We call it the fiscal multiplier. The second question that, frankly, when I started my career at the IMF, we were not really focusing on was the impact of fiscal consolidation on social sectors, on social spending. Countries were advised to implement a specific fiscal consolidation program. Here's the magnitude, here's the speed. And we didn't really pay attention to the impact that this could have on social sectors. And we were criticized because in the end, countries facing these needs for large adjustments ended up having no other alternative than cut also critical social programs with a bad impact on poverty and inequality. So over time, I think we have become much more aware, and I'm speaking still about cases where that is sustainable. We have become much more aware of the impact that fiscal consolidation can have on growth and on the social dimension. This is why we try to calibrate the magnitude. Well, does it need to be 3.3% of GDP, or can it be a little bit less? Of course, country authorities will always tell us that we are a little bit biased towards the large part of the adjustment, and it tends to happen. Does it need to be so large? The speed is important, and often we had unrealistic expectations of, you know, we want to see the debt come down quickly. So in 3 years, we want to see the deficit come down. And that speed may be mathematically optimal in some sort of research paper, but behind a country, there are authorities that face real choices and real trade-offs. So looking also at the speed, at the appropriate speed is important. And the composition, what do you do with the composition? Do you focus more on revenues? In some countries, for example, Egypt has potential to collect some more revenues. In other countries, we found, for example, that some expenditure lines require some adjustment, subsidies or wages. So it's important to look at these three things: getting the magnitude right, getting the speed and the composition correctly, and especially emphasizing, to the extent possible, finding a package that protects social spending. So that's about fiscal consolidation. Unfortunately, if your level of debt is high, it's very difficult to avoid fiscal consolidation as part of the solution. The second thing is, it's important in our view. It's also something that we probably neglected 20 years ago. The importance of reforms. When you have a dialogue with countries, it's not just about the numbers, but again, it's what other reforms can this country introduce or follow to support growth? What are the reforms in the business environment? What are the reforms in institutions that can support private sector growth? Because at the end of the day, if a country doesn't grow, the fiscal consolidation is not going to succeed, because the growth will be low, revenues will be low, and you might end up in the category of the countries where debt has become unsustainable. So important to emphasize reforms. And a third component is the role of fiscal institutions. And we find it's very important that countries strengthen their fiscal institutions. Sometimes that may mean having a fiscal rule where you express clearly, over the medium term, we intend our debt level to be a specific percent of GDP, or we are targeting an overall fiscal or primary balance of a specific amount. These rules are important if they are followed, and of course, rules also have difficulties. They need to have some flexibility and escape clauses, but they are useful because they present a commitment of rigor that can help authorities increase their credibility over time. Now, despite all that, in some cases, you just come to the conclusion that there is no feasible program of economic reforms and fiscal consolidation that can make your debt sustainable. This was the case of Zambia when I was the mission chief for Zambia. It was the case of the Republic of Congo when I was the mission chief. It just didn't work out. You did the math. It was not possible to suggest a level of adjustment that would have destroyed the country. It would basically, you have to slash the budget in half. That's not possible. And when that happens, it becomes very complicated, because we at the IMF, we have to be neutral. It's a dialogue between the country authorities and the lenders, and we can facilitate the dialogue with our analysis on debt sustainability to share with the country authorities. In fact, we work with them also on the technical assessment of what we think would be feasible in terms of adjustment and in terms of debt relief. In that context, I think several principles are helpful to help in those cases. One is the principle of transparency. Often lenders are going to be suspicious about requests for debt relief when they don't have access to information. What is the composition of this debt? Who are these loans owed to? For what types of projects? It's very important to show transparency about your debt stock and publish the information. That is going to give some comfort to the lenders that they know what is being restructured. The other principle, I think, is burden sharing. There's always going to be some tension between the sovereign creditors, the private sector creditors, different types of countries. They all want to perceive that the authorities are treating them fairly, that nobody is providing debt relief to pay another creditor. So this is also a crucial point. The other point that we learned over time, and this is thanks to the work of some of my colleagues at the IMF, in particular Jeremy Zettelmeyer and Yan Liu, who's now the general counsel, is that once this determination of debt problem has been made, that debt isn't sustainable, it's important not to procrastinate, because countries are often reluctant to start the process or continue, because there is this reputational risk associated with it. But once that has happened, once the technical analysis has been done, it's important to proceed quickly, because these processes take time. It can take 2 or 3 years to complete the process. Another difficulty that we often find is the question of coordination. As I was mentioning earlier in my career, when we were dealing with countries with a high level of debt, there was a coordinating mechanism in the Paris Club and the HIPIC initiative. Now it's more complicated because countries have more diverse debt with financial markets, with different players. There is a framework, the G20 common framework, that is beginning to produce some results, but it's more difficult than in the old times. So I think, just to sum up, I think it's important to separate the two cases. If a country can provide a credible economic reform package. It's always better to avoid a default. But even when that package is there, it's important to get the magnitude of the adjustment right, protecting social spending, having some program to generate growth for the private sector, and building your institutions. And if that doesn't work and you end up in a case of default, then it's going to be more difficult. But there are some countries that are beginning to succeed.
Yes. So I just wanted to clarify that an
The
IMF
sound, the sound.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify that an IMF supported program, and we call it IMF supported program. It's the program of the authorities, the IMF support. It's there to help the country. It's not designed to bail out creditors or to support a specific a ruling group of people. It's supposed to help the country stabilize its macroeconomic situation. That's what I meant in my initial comment, which was taken out of context. I think I agree with the comment that Professor Bruni made about the importance of reforming the IMF, also because the IMF is also a political institution. It reflects the votes of the memberships. And so it's important that countries that are becoming more important in the economic, in the global economy acquire its proper voice. The third comment that I would make is that governments can make mistakes in the implementation of their economic programs, but the IMF also makes mistakes, and we have recognized some of these mistakes. We created an independent evaluation office. I started my career there, where we were looking at some of the mistakes that the IMF made in the Asian crisis and also in Argentina. And part of those evaluations are also to tell us, to the technical teams of the IMF, some of the aspects of the programs didn't work well because you neglected some social aspects of the programs. You were not looking at social spending. You are underestimating the impact of your policies on growth. And this also affected your legitimacy. And this is why sometimes we're not very popular. And the fourth comment, final comment I would make, is the importance of governments and strong institutions. There are countries that are making legitimate efforts to strengthen their institutions and increase transparency, and suffer external shocks that make their financial situation more difficult. And these countries deserve a special support. There are countries that get into problems with debt precisely because some of the projects didn't have a high rate of return, and there the conversation is going to be more difficult with the creditors.